Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for our presentation today, The What and Why of Distracted Driving. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Transportation Learning Network and the Commercial Vehicle Safety Center. TLN and the CVSC are programs of the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute at North Dakota State University. Today's presentation materials may be found on the Commercial Vehicle Safety Center website, and that will also be linked in the chat when I'm done here. At this point, I'll hand it over to Brenda Lance. She's our Associate Director of Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute and the Director of the Commercial Vehicle Safety Center.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And just good morning to everyone. It's so great to see so many attendees on the meeting today from such a wide variety of places as well. And just thank you for taking the time to join us. And thanks as well to our speaker today, Amy Cox, and to Chris and all the other staff with our Transportation Learning Network for their help in coordinating this meeting. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration for the grant funding that makes our work as well as these webinars possible. As Chris mentioned, for those who don't know me, my name is Brenda Lance, and I'm the Associate Director of the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute at North Dakota State University, as well as the Program Director for our Commercial Vehicle Safety Center, or CVSC for short. Again, we're excited to have all of you join us. So the webinar today is going to help us to understand the barriers preventing drivers from driving without using their devices. And also, what drivers perceive would motivate them to stop driving distracted. Suggestions for future topics for future webinars are always welcome. So if anything comes up as we're proceeding today during this webinar or at a later time, feel free to contact me with any ideas you might have. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Amy Cox is a research associate at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. She holds a Master of Public Health degree in epidemiology from the University of South Florida and a Bachelor of Science degree from Eastern Michigan University. And since joining the Institute in 2020, she has authored papers on the safety of older drivers, as well as, of course, on driver distraction. So Amy, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much. As Brenda just mentioned, we conducted this survey to better understand what drivers are doing when they're behind the wheel, why they're doing it, and then what might motivate them to stop. So the concerns with distracted driving have existed for decades. This is by no means a new issue. Brought in this magazine ad that dates back to 1935 when there was a concern that car radio use was too distracting, and there were some states that were proposing that they be banned. However, the types of common distractions change over time. So it's vital that we keep up on what secondary tasks drivers are doing. The introduction of the cell phone introduced a new source of distraction, initially in the form of handheld phone conversations. But as cell phones have evolved to allow for database capabilities, how drivers are using their phones when behind the wheel has changed. In the decade of observations from 2011 to 2020, NHTSA has observed a decline in handheld phone conversations and an increase in handheld manipulation of devices. During this observation period, the observed manipulation of cell phones doubled, and the prevalence surpassed traditional phone conversations in 2020. And this is troubling because of what we know about secondary tasks that require a great deal of visual manual demand and crash risk. So tasks thinking like typing a text message, scrolling social media, or a web page, those are tasks that require a great deal of visual manual demand. And they are associated with higher crash risks than tasks that allowed the driver to keep their eyes on the road and hands on the steering wheel. So thinking about a traditional phone conversation or a phone conversation through your car's Bluetooth. So we conducted a nationally representative survey using a mixed modal approach to find out what sorts of secondary tasks drivers are doing today and what might motivate them to stop. 30% of the surveys were conducted by landline and cell phone. The remaining 70% were conducted online. We had 2,013 participants, all licensed drivers ages 16 and older, and the instrument consisted of roughly 60 questions and took a half hour to complete. So a little bit more into the weeds in terms of the goals of the survey. First, what secondary activities are distracting drivers today? So what are the sources of distraction? We made a point to capture more modern device-based tasks that weren't around or as common as they are today when the last nationwide survey was conducted in 2015. To find out what the sources of distraction are, we asked drivers how often they did in the previous 30 days 18 secondary tasks. 14 were device-based and 4 were non-device-based. We used a 5-point Likert scale ranging from every time, most of the time, sometimes, rarely to never. And we also wanted to know if drivers are using hands-free capabilities when that is an option. We found that among the device-based tasks, programming a GPS, making phone calls, streaming music, and reading text messages were the most prevalent. Half or more of the sample indicated they did each of these tasks at least rarely. Even though the more modern device-based tasks like watching movies or clips, recording or posting videos, and playing games were the least common, these results are certainly a cause for concern. Less than 25% of the sample did these tasks at least rarely, but 8 to 10% of the sample reported doing these tasks most or every time they drove. So this means that many of the drivers who do these tasks are doing them often. And these are the tasks that require the driver to divert their eyes from the road for an extended period of time and do not have reasonable hands-free alternatives. Talking with passengers was the most prevalent non-device-based task, with 83% of the sample doing it so at least rarely. And then grooming or applying makeup was the least common. Only about 28% of the sample indicated they did so at least rarely when they drove in the previous 30 days. This slide shows the breakdown of hands-free and handheld use among the participants who said they did these secondary tasks while driving most or every time they drove in the previous 30 days. So we can see that most of the drivers who reported doing these tasks most or every time they drove use hands-free at least most of the time to do them. So this is certainly promising. However, we do see some of the tasks are done hands-free more than others. 81% who regularly programmed a GPS reported doing so hands-free at least most of the time. Only about 70% who regularly sent and received text messages did so hands-free. So this suggests that there might be a need for voice capabilities to be refined for some tasks to increase consumer acceptance. Using the 18 secondary tasks that we asked about, we created 4 distraction categories. A participant belonged to a category if they reported doing one or more of the tasks most or every time they drove. You'll also hear me say they did the task regularly. The 4 tasks were any distraction, so this would be all of the 18 tasks, device-based distractions, modern device-based distractions, and non-device-based distractions. We found that 2/3 of the sample fell under the any distraction category. Half reported doing at least one device-based task most or every time they drove. 45% regularly did one or more non-device-based tasks, and 21% did at least one modern device-based task, like making a video call or playing an application-based game. So who are these distracted drivers? We'll start with age, and we saw a similar pattern across categories where drivers under the age of 35 were most likely to engage in a secondary task than drivers 35 and older. The lightest blue represents the any distraction category. We can see that any distraction was steady through age 34 and declines began around age 35. The proportion of drivers in the device-based and the modern device-based distraction categories increased to peak between the ages of 25 to 34. Again, we saw declines beginning with age 35. And then the darkest blue represents the non-device distraction. We saw the prevalence was pretty steady through age 49, and declines began with age 50. So this is how the 4 distraction categories look when looking at age. Males were more likely to belong to the any, device-based, and modern device distraction categories. Females were slightly more likely to engage in non-device distractions. Again, a side-by-side of all 4 categories. And with this effort, we uncovered two demographics of concern. For starters, parents of children ages 18 or younger and gig economy drivers. So relative to participants who did not have children ages 18 or younger, parents of children in that age category were more likely to fall in each of the distraction categories. And the same applied to gig economy drivers. So when I say gig economy, I'm referring to rideshare or delivery services like Uber or Lyft. These participants were more likely to drive distracted than participants who did not do that type of work. And again, the side-by-side, two demographic categories, and then the yeses and nos. So the second goal was to understand why drivers are using their cell phones when behind the wheel and what might encourage them to stop. The health belief model lent itself really nicely to these goals. Since we wanted to focus on the drivers who regularly use cell phones when driving, we used the half of our sample that were categorized as a device-based distracted driver as our distracted driving group. The other half served as our comparison. So for the remainder of this presentation, distracted driving will be synonymous with device-based distractions. So the health belief model suggests that the main constructs work together to predict if a person will adopt a desired health behavior. We focused on the three original constructs of perceived barriers and benefits, perceived threats, and cues to action. These are the constructs that we felt stakeholders could best address. So that's why we paid the most attention to them. I'll provide more detail on each of these original constructs and examples of the questions we asked for them next. We'll start with threat perception. Threat perception is made up of severity and susceptibility. Perceived susceptibility refers to one's feelings about how high a risk or the likelihood of some sort of adverse consequence from driving distracted is. So a driver might assess how likely they think crashing or getting injured is. They also might evaluate susceptibility to legal penalties resulting from driving distracted. For perceived severity, a driver might evaluate how bad would those adverse consequences be. So this could be, how bad would a crash be if it was because I was distracted? How long would it take to recover from injuries I sustained in a crash? How much would the associated fine be? When evaluating barriers, one assesses the things that are preventing them from adopting the desired behavior. For using cell phones while driving, we thought of the obvious ones being family or work demands, needing information like directions or weather conditions, and perceived urgency of the matter. So we asked about those among others. So anything that would make not driving distracted too inconvenient or difficult for the driver. When evaluating benefits, a driver might ask, will me not driving distracted reduce my risk of being in a crash, getting injured, causing injury to somebody else? Would there be societal benefit if no one drove distracted, like through decreased insurance premiums in response to potentially fewer crashes? So we wanted to take a close look at the barriers. So we categorized barrier questions by themes. We found distracted drivers said it would be hard to not use their device while driving if they needed directions or other information, if they needed to communicate with someone urgently, and if they needed to talk with their family or friends. Cues to action can be internal or external, so we framed our questions with this in mind and then categorized them again by theme, similar to how we categorized our barriers. We used two scales for these questions: agree, disagree, and support or oppose. Some examples of the questions that we asked were, would you be motivated to stop because you knew it was the right thing to do to protect yourself and your loved ones? So what sort of internal or individual motivators might be at play? Could your family or friends motivate you to stop if they told you they didn't feel safe, that you could hurt someone, that they reminded you if the behavior was illegal? Would you be motivated to not drive distracted if your workplace requested it? Would you support educational campaigns to inform high school students on the dangers of driving distracted? Would you be motivated to stop if you used your device more than the average person or your peers? What if it were as socially unacceptable as driving under the influence of alcohol or other drugs? Would you be motivated to not drive distracted if your risk of getting a ticket were high, if the fine was $200 or more? What if the legal penalties were just as harsh as those for driving under the influence of alcohol or other drugs? We also wanted to know about support for increased enforcement of distracted driving laws in an individual's community. We also asked about technology. One thing we wanted to know is if drivers would support a do not disturb while driving function, that rather than requiring the user to opt into the feature, the feature would just engage every time the device connected to the paired vehicle's Bluetooth. We also wanted to know if public service announcements would motivate drivers. So we provided a few examples of those to see if that would motivate drivers to put their devices down. For the cue to action questions that fell under the agree and disagree scale, distracted drivers most strongly perceived that feelings of personal responsibility, family and friends, and laws in their enforcement might best motivate them to stop driving distracted. One thing I found really interesting about these results when comparing them with the top barriers listed was that friends and family were on both lists. So drivers are saying, I'm having a difficult time putting my phone down if my friends and family are calling or texting, but these are the same people that could best motivate me to stop. So I think this provides a really unique opportunity and relationship to target when it comes to countermeasures. And one thing I also wanted to point out here with the cues to action is that public service announcements or messages, that was the only category that received stronger agreement in the perceived efficacy by distracted drivers than the non-distracted drivers, but messages received the lowest agreement overall. For the cue to action questions that fell into the support or oppose scale, distracted drivers did not indicate opposition to the implementation of any of these cue to action categories. Organizational countermeasures were most supported by distracted drivers. So this would be something like an educational campaign in schools designed for distracted driving, similar to what has been done to raise awareness for alcohol use while driving. We found 77% of the sample supported such school campaigns. Technological countermeasures were supported equally between the two groups of drivers. Drivers sampled most strongly supported the do not disturb while driving feature that did not require opting in. And then the most strongly supported policy countermeasure was for an increase in law enforcement targeting the use of distracted driving or device use. And 70% of the sample supported that countermeasure. When looking at mean responses for the model components, distracted drivers appear to understand the threat of using devices while driving and the benefits of stopping. They also somewhat agreed that the cues to action might motivate them to stop. However, they agreed less so than the non-distracted drivers. We see that for the distracted drivers, the barriers to stopping are much stronger than the non-distracted drivers. We used logistic regression to estimate the odds of not driving distracted by devices. So this is what the model looks like if we put all of the components together to predict not driving distracted. We used level of agreement in these constructs as our exposure. When controlling for all of the constructs in the model, more agreement in the threats and less agreement in the barriers significantly predicted not driving distracted. Agreement in the benefits and cues to action were not predictive of the behavior. So this suggests that people who drive distracted are much more likely to downplay the threats of the behavior. And these drivers are also much more likely to agree that the barriers are too strong to overcome. Through this survey, we found that distracted driving is widespread. We also found that no demographic that we studied abstains. However, the behavior is most concentrated in drivers under the age of 35, males, parents, and gig economy drivers. Hands-free functions are used, but we found that for some subtasks more than others. So this suggests that refinement of some systems might improve user acceptance, particularly things like, again, for sending or reading text messages. Distracted drivers downplay the threats and agree much more on the barriers preventing them from stopping. Pleas from family and friends and policy level cues were supported and thought to be effective. So I wanted to leave you all with a reminder that the health belief model states the main constructs work together to predict the behavior. Our results here suggest that the behavior manifests for a variety of reasons, and none are mutually exclusive. So with that being said, we need to embrace that systems approach in finding solutions by addressing all of the constructs. Implementing cues to action is only one piece of the puzzle. And in my opinion, it's not HS's opinion, but just me, I've seen a lot of countermeasures. I see a lot of ads motivating drivers to put their phone down. But I think we need to do a bit more work in terms of increasing threat perceptions and finding solutions to the barriers if we want to move that needle. Finally, this is just one of many behavioral change theories. The health belief model just lent itself and most closely aligned with our goals. So it's important to remember that when interpreting these results, that the questions were largely posed as hypotheticals. So how drivers respond to these questions may not accurately reflect how they were to respond if any of these countermeasures were implemented. That said, this study did allow us to gain some insight into what might work and the areas that we need to address. So that is all I have. I know we have plenty of time for questions now, so happy to open up the floor to that.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. Really good information. Yeah, just a comment as folks are thinking of any particular questions they might have. I know in your the full paper for this study, you do reference a variety of resources that are available.
Yes.
Especially in terms of some of the countermeasures you mentioned, things that people could look at. And I know specifically probably pertinent to a lot of folks on this call are, companies who hire drivers, if they're considering implementing like a workplace safe driving policy. There's a number of resources available for that type of thing. And I think there's even some templates available from the National Distracted Driving Coalition that you reference in your paper as well. So yes, there's lots of good links to information and resources available throughout your study as well.
Absolutely. Definitely encourage anyone who employs people who drive for work to check out those resources. If it helps, I can post a link to the paper or send a paper to all the participants. That way it's easily referenceable.
Great. Yeah, we'll definitely post it on our website as well, just so people have access to it for sure.
Great.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and just in terms of like you're talking about, that was kind of an interesting point you made, with family and friends being one of the reasons why people, access their devices or whatever, but family and friends are also the reason why people might not, might stop from doing that. And so, yes, I think there's also some resources referenced, that you can make like contracts with your children, for example, things like that, that can help to reduce that distracted driving.
Exactly. Yeah. And it can go both ways. It doesn't have to only apply to the teen driver. And I think that's a really good opportunity or contract to enter to hold the parent or the adult accountable to. And I think oftentimes we just think about teens being the problem, but as we saw here, when it comes to the devices and particularly the modern device tasks, so making video calls or scrolling social media, we found the 18 to 24-year-olds were doing those more often than the youngest drivers.
Right. Kind of reminds me a little bit of seatbelts. How younger generations obviously just weren't as used to or I should say older generations now weren't as used to the seatbelts. But it's interesting, it's like I still remember when my son, when he first started going to school and like he had hopped in the car, put on your seatbelt, mommy,
Mm-hmm.
So it is kind of interesting. It's like teaching that younger generation to make sure everyone's safe.
Yes, absolutely. And one other thing I'd like to point out with that is other research has found it's not what the teens see the parent doing, but it's more their perceptions of what the parent does.
Right.
So that's a really big thing to keep in mind. It's what your teen thinks you're doing, your child thinks you're doing, and what they think is acceptable to you that influences then their behavior. So certainly good idea to set those examples, those positive examples.
So we do have a couple questions. The first one we have is, how did you define or categorize distracted versus non-distracted drivers, and what was the distribution?
So let me go back to that screen. In terms of how we categorized them, it was a driver who said they did one or more of the tasks within that category most or every time they drove in the previous 30 days. So we asked on a 5-point scale, most, sometimes, or most often, sometimes, rarely, or never. Sorry, I really have to go back here. Here we go. Okay. Okay. So for the device-based distraction, I'll highlight that since that's the category that we use for the health belief model analysis. So any device-based task, so this would be programming a GPS, making a phone call, texting, emailing, and then also those modern device tasks, so Snapchat, TikTok, video calls. If a driver said they did one or more of those secondary tasks most or every time they drove, they fell into that category.
Okay. And did you ask about the type or size of vehicles that were being driven and any specific commercial vehicle data available?
We did not ask about that. So this was more just a general, what do you do on a normal driving basis. We did again ask about at the end for the demographic questions if drivers drive for the gig economy, so the Uber or Lyft, but we didn't ask specifically about do drivers drive for other types of work.
Okay, and I think that led right into our next question was, what is a gig economy driver?
Okay, yes. So Instacart, DoorDash, Uber, Lyft, so the ride share or the delivery type services.
Okay. And then one of your slides actually showed this example, and it's kind of a comment that came through here in the chat, and that is the screen. So how the screens are working in newer vehicles, all the buttons on the screen that used to be separate and now not needing the scrolling through the pages to access them. So I've noticed in a lot of newer vehicles, they're making their displays and their screens so much larger, and everything is on that screen now, and that's not in the primary line of sight of a driver. I'm just adding to this because it is a very common thing. That's something I don't think sometimes we think about it, but all your tasks are now centered in the car, and you're looking down at your screen to do things. So car manufacturers are almost, I don't want to say guilty, but they're almost promoting that distraction.
Yes, I think it'll be interesting to see in another 5-10 years how those screens, it's certainly going to take some time to see how they may lead to changes and crashes. But I agree. One thing I will say, at least with the newer vehicles, a lot of tasks are voice enabled. So it might be a bit of a learning curve. I know I struggle to do it myself in my vehicle, but I can set the temperature or change the radio channel with my voice. I just, it's getting to the point of actually doing that and not resorting to the screen. And so, yeah, I understand completely what you're saying.
And then, we mentioned the younger population driving and how they've kind of become used to the technology, or they've been told not to do it. So it's kind of in that mentality, and maybe some of the older drivers are getting used to the technology, so they're not quite as adept to it. I remember once upon a time ago, insurance companies, and maybe it was only one insurance company at a time, they started installing cameras for your new drivers so that you could either earn discounts or you could monitor their driving behaviors. And I know that on the commercial side, a lot of commercial vehicle companies are installing cameras now. Is there any correlation, or are you able to pull data or statistics from that information to help identify like the level of distraction that's happening even at that level? Is it more so on, can you use that data to figure out like an age demographic that's more distracted versus that, the older, maybe the worker generation is doing it? Can you use that data, or have you used it?
That's a really good question. I don't know much about the type of data that is pulled. So when it comes to the driver monitoring, a lot of times, depending on the technology, I don't know if it's an actual person that's being watched or if it's just the algorithm that's detecting where the eye gaze is. So I know there's some variation in the technology itself. So what has actually been rolled out to those commercial vehicles, I'm not sure to really answer the question. But I certainly do think that driver monitoring in general is promising when it comes to monitoring distraction, particularly as we're heading into more of a level 2 automation. So really to be able to make sure the driver's eyes are on the road, again, whether or not it's eye gaze or, the actual camera monitoring what the driver's doing, where the hands are. Certainly something that does seem promising for keeping distractions down.
I have a friend who runs a commercial vehicle operation, and his cameras monitor of course, front of the vehicle, and of course the driver, and so it monitors a lot of behavior.
Okay.
It monitors, of course, speed limit signs, signals, so the regulatory signage and lighting that's out there. And then it will also monitor sudden changes in direction. So whether it's a fast acceleration, a hard braking, or a sudden shift from side to side. And then it will actually start it monitors it all the time, but then it'll start recording at that point once it notices a change. And what I was told was AI monitors a lot of that for those flags. And then once AI flags things that need a human to observe it, it sends it to whoever is monitoring it. And then that goes back to the company for review to determine whether or not if something were to happen where there could be some potential fault or where there could be some safety violations to keep the drivers alert and aware.
It's very interesting. It would be great to do some sort of study on that. Of course, it would just be access to the data, but that would be fascinating to be able to do.
And on the flip side of that, I have a friend who drives for a delivery company. I won't say the company's name, but I asked him about cameras because this was coming up. And I said, are there cameras in your cab? And how do you monitor, how do they monitor the driver's behavior? And he just laughed and he says, well, personally, I put tape over mine. So
Right.
I don't know how, maybe that's acceptable, but I don't know how that kind of goes either. But anyway.
I think that comes down to that company policy again.
Exactly. Yep.
I just
the company. Yep.
Right. Real quick, Chris, before we move on to the next question, I was just kind of thinking along that same lines of technology. In addition to cameras, obviously there's many other, kind of those advanced driver assistance systems, in vehicles these days. You got the lane departure warnings, blind spot detection, automatic braking. So I'm just kind of curious, if you have any more insights into how those systems are changing distracted driving behaviors.
I think it's twofold. On the one hand, we know from some of our other work at IIHS that these technologies, particularly automatic emergency braking, is reducing rear-end crashes by half. We also know that rear-end crashes are a really good surrogate for distraction. So we have the technology that we see is working to reduce crashes. Lane departure is another one. It's only reducing crashes by about 27%, so not as substantial as the automatic emergency braking systems. But if you're not paying attention, you can see how easily it would be to accidentally depart your lane. So we have these technologies, and they're more and more widespread. Particularly AEB, 20 automakers voluntarily pledged to equip primarily all of their passenger vehicle fleet by September of last year. So they're really making good strides on that. So that is certainly promising on the one hand. On the other, we hope that these technologies don't lead people to think that it's a substitute for safe driving. So we don't want these technologies to then encourage more distraction. So it's kind of, like I said, it plays both ways.
There's, again, just another comment about the hybrid work environment, how that could be creating a little bit more of that distracted environment as well, because they could be driving to a in-person meeting or to a destination, and at the same time they're on a Zoom call. And so they could be taking that virtual meeting at the same time. So again, just another category for distraction, another level of distraction.
Exactly.
And then there was one who just kind of commented on the cameras. So they monitor with cameras, and it's a disciplinary action in their company.
Okay.
So imagine they might watch for the tape being put over the camera.
You stop doing that. What's it going to be? Well, while anybody else is thinking of any additional questions, if you would not mind entertaining, I'm going to throw a poll up, and the poll is kind of a way to do the evaluation of this presentation. So I'm going to launch that, and I'll just leave it running in the background. So if you wouldn't mind taking time to complete this poll, there will be another opportunity to complete an evaluation of today's presentation at the conclusion. But if you would like to do it this way and then skip that one later on, you certainly can. Or if you want to do both, we welcome both of those. So if there are any additional questions or comments, feel free to either put them in the chat, or if you want to ask the question or make the comment directly, you may unmute yourself and ask it directly.
I had one other one I was kind of curious about, whether or not, Amy, you have any information related to distracting behaviors that pedestrians are engaging in that might be contributing to some of the increases we've seen in pedestrian fatalities.
Yes. So when we designed the survey, we were really mostly concerned about what drivers are doing. But with that being said, the characteristics of pedestrian crashes haven't really changed that much. So they're still occurring at night on unlit roads or high-speed roads where there aren't really designated crosswalks. So while we didn't necessarily ask about distracted driving pedestrian behaviors for this effort, it does seem like because of the lack of built environment for pedestrians, people are unfortunately still crossing in unsafe conditions, and that's why we're seeing a big spike in pedestrian fatalities.
Right. All right. Any other questions, comments? All right. Well, thanks again, Amy, for your presentation and the great discussion today. All this great information. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar is part of our Commercial Vehicle Safety Center, so you will be able to view both the slides and the recording from this webinar, as well as we also have the slides and recordings from past webinars on our website, and I just posted the link for that in the chat box for you. Our goal of our center is to provide resources, assistance, primarily to help establish partnerships between agencies, industries, universities, to do this type of research and just to improve C&V safety. So if you're interested in forming a partnership or would like any more information, please reference our website or feel free to contact me directly. And then, as Chris mentioned, you do have the opportunity to complete that short evaluation survey. So if you're able to do that now or at a later time, we'd appreciate any feedback or suggestions you might have for possible future topics as well. So thanks again for everyone for attending today, and I'll turn it over to Chris to close the session.
Pretty simple. Thank you for attending today's event, and thank you again, Amy, for sharing this research information. I think it's very important to understand, kind of the thought process behind it all. So we certainly appreciate everyone else's time, participation, and attention. We hope you enjoyed and gained some new knowledge from today's presentation. That being said, have a fantastic week, be safe, and don't forget to be awesome.